Thank you very much. It's good to be here. It's 85 degrees in Los Angeles. I'm just saying. It's a privilege to be here. I've never been here before, and indeed an honor, and thank you for your hospitality. It's the privilege of my life for over 30 years to have worked with gang members and to have them alter my heart and change my life. And the day won't ever come when I have more courage, or I am more noble, or I'm closer to God than the thousands of men and women I've been privileged to know. People like Luis Perez, who used to work at Homeboy, and he kind of ran the place for a time, and kind of a force of nature, heroin addict and gang member, and been to prison for a stretch. He was also greatly in demand as a speaker, and I'd send him out, and then people would ask for him by name, and he was quite getting a reputation as a speaker. We went out to dinner, and he was giving me tips on how to speak publicly. He said, G, you gotta pepper your talk with self-defecating humor. I said, yeah, no shit. That's some good advice there, so brace yourselves. Here's why I think you're here tonight, not because you were forced to read my book against your will at some point in your academic career. I think you're here because there's a longing out there wanting the world to look differently than it currently looks. What Martin Luther King says about a church could well be said of your time here at Ohio Dominican University, that it's not the place you've come to, it's the place you go from. And you go from here and you try to create a community of kinship such that God, in fact, might recognize it. Mother Teresa, I think, diagnosed the world's ills when she said correctly, the problem in the world is that we've just forgotten that we belong to each other. So how do we stand against forgetting that? How do we, with God, imagine a circle of compassion and then imagine nobody standing outside that circle? How do we go from this place to dismantle the barriers that exclude? And Pope Francis always is inviting us to the margins because that's where the joy is. But if you go to the margins, look under your feet. The margins are getting erased precisely because you chose to stand there. And you stand with a particularity. You stand with the poor and the powerless and the voiceless. You get to stand with those whose burdens are more than they can bear and those whose dignity has been denied. Every once in a while, there's this extraordinary privilege to be able to stand with the easily despised and the readily left out. You go to the margins and you will be able to stand with the demonized so that the demonizing will stop, and with the disposable so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. I suspect if kinship happened to be our goal, we wouldn't be promoting justice, we'd be celebrating it. For no kinship, no peace, no kinship, no justice, no kinship, no equality. ODU is not the place you've come to, it's the place you go from to announce that message. So none of this makes any damn sense, unless we have a spacious and expansive sense of our God. Because you'll have to brace yourself when you go to the margins, because people will accuse you of wasting your time. So you need a kind of a larger love to hang on to. The prophet Jeremiah writes, "In this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing." You go to the margins so that other voices might get heard. But we need a sense of God that we can align our hearts with. so that we can choose to decide to live in each other's hearts. But sometimes our God can be puny. We settle for a partial God, a lesser God, a more realistic God. The God we actually have is spacious and huge and expansive, or what St. Ignatius of Loyola says, the God who is always greater. I had a spiritual director once who said, we need a better God than the one we have. And he was a Jesuit, but I think he was right. How do we find this expansive God so that we can align our hearts there? So the homies have taught me so much, and often it comes by way of the mangling of the English language, which I always find ultimately quite illuminating. They out-yogi Bara yogi. And like a homegirl named Lisa came into my office, and it was the end of the day. She's one of our trainees in our 18-month training program, a gang member. She wanted to introduce her man to me who came to pick her up, and she says, "This is my sufficient other." I said, "No doubt." I can be with you now because I have a CEO named Tom Volso who runs Homeboy Industries, which is nice, so I don't have to run. It's a $19 million annual operation, so I'm happy not to have to worry about cash flow and budgets. So I'm in my office, and a homie comes in, and he says, "Damn, gee, my lady, she is in a bad mood today." I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, she's beginning her administration period." I said, "Well, I just finished mine, so I kind of know what she's going through." But my favorite one came by way of, I was celebrating the Eucharist at San Fernando Juvenile Hall, and we were in a gym like this, and there were like 500 chairs on the floor for all the homies, mainly all gang members who were locked up in Juvenile Hall. And I was vested, my album, my stole, and they had kind of a sheet, that had the readings on it in English and Spanish. And I thought, well, I'm going to let this just rest on my lap. I'm going to close my eyes, and I'm going to listen to the word proclaimed by the homies. And so the first guy got up and did the first reading, and then the second guy got up to do the psalm, and he, kind of with an overabundance of confidence, he got up and he said, "The Lord is exhausted." And I said, "What the hell?" And it was "The Lord is exalted." And I remember thinking at the time, wow, that's way better. I mean, after all, the exalted God is frankly the God that we've created in our own likeness. That's a partial God. But the exhausted God, wow, that is a better God. Generous, other-centered, not self-referential, really. It's all about you wanting to give and not to count the cost. The exhausted God is a better God. Somehow we want to arrive at the God we actually have, otherwise it won't make any sense to go from this place, to go to the margins, to create a community of kinship. The homies, among all the many things that they've taught me, and I'm so grateful to them, but they've taught me how to text, and I tell you, especially on the road, I'm so grateful because I find it sure beats the heck out of actually talking to people. And I'm pretty good at it, LOL and OMG and BTW, and the homies have taught me a new one, OHN, which apparently stands for, "Oh, hell no." And I've been using that one quite a bit lately. I know I can't be alone in being vexed by this autocorrect thing. I had a homegirl not long ago, Bertha, she's a tough cookie, and she texts me on a Sunday and she says, "Where you at?" And I text her back, "I'm about to speak to a room full of monjas," and monjas are sisters, nuns, religious women. "I'm about to speak to a room full of monjas." I push send, autocorrect told her that I was about to speak to a room full of ninjas. We got a few rows up front here. Well, she thought that was pretty, darn interesting. I was, I just derailed myself with the ninjas in the front rows here. So I just lost my train of thought. So homies mainly right now, even now, all day long, their hair is on fire and they need to pay bills and they're gonna cut off my lights, and I'm the priest they mistook for an ATM machine. But so this homie texted me and he said he just needed $100 to finish off his rent. Well, I didn't have it. So I wrote him back simply, things are tight. I pushed send. Autocorrect told him, thongs are tight. He wrote back, sorry to hear that. What about my rent? So there I am with two older homies, older vatos, Manuel and Poncho. They're going to help me give a talk in Palm Desert at a high school. So we meet in the morning after our morning meeting with 400 gang members in our lobby. And they get in the car and we drive, and Manuel's in the front seat. And 15 minutes on the road, he gets an incoming and he reads it to himself and he chuckles. And I said, what is it? He goes, oh, it's dumb. It's from Snoopy back at the office. Well, I just seen Snoopy. Snoopy gave me a big abrazo, a big hug as the day was beginning. Snoopy and Manuel work together in the clock-in room where they clock in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of our workers, all gang members. It's a tough job. I would not want it because this may come as a surprise. Gang members can occasionally be attitudinal. So I said, what's he saying? He goes, oh, hang on, it's dumb. Let me find it. Here it is. Hey, dog, it's me, Snoops. Yeah, they got my ass locked up at county jail. They're charging me with being the ugliest vato in America. You have to come down right now, show them they got the wrong guy. Well, I nearly drove in oncoming traffic, and then I realized that Manuel and Snoopy are enemies. They're from rival gangs. They used to shoot bullets at each other, because I remember. Now they shoot text messages. And there's a word for that, and the word is kinship. How do we obliterate once and for all the illusion that we are separate, that there is an us and a them? All of you in this room have been engaged or currently engaged in service, and service is obviously a good thing, but it's the first thing. Service is the hallway that's meant to get you to the ballroom. The ballroom is the place of kinship and connection. That's where you want to arrive. Because the truth of the matter is that in service, even in service, there's distance. There can be. Service provider, service recipient. You want to bridge even that distance. At Homeboy, I'm not the great healer, and that gang member over there is in need of my exquisite healing. The truth be told, we're all a cry for help. We're all in need of healing. In fact, it's one of the things that joins us together as members of the human family. One of the great privileges of my life was knowing Cesar Chavez as a friend. And he was just absolutely the best listener I've ever been in the presence of. If you were talking to him, nobody else existed, just you, laser beam focused. He was never looking over your shoulder to see if somebody more important was on the approach. But quite famously, once a reporter had commented to him and said, wow, these farm workers, they sure love you. And Cesar shrugged and smiled and said, the feeling's mutual. And that's the hope. How do we arrive at this exquisite mutuality where there is no daylight that separates us, not even service provider, service recipient? No homie found more job opportunities through Homeboy Industries than a guy we all called Dreamer. I knew him since he was a little mocosito growing up in the housing projects, and he got into a gang. His older brothers were in a gang. One of the smartest kids I think I've ever known, super bright, though I don't recall that he ever actually went to school, but a super dangerous sense of humor, which I always enjoyed. And he's in his 40s now, married, home, kids, a good job. But in his early 20s, he was a yo-yo, in and out of being locked up. I'd find him a job in the private sector or in one of our enterprises. And before too long, he'd always gravitate back to vague criminality, usually something involving drugs, the sale of or the use of, and then he'd wander back to me. So it was a very frustrating pattern that kept repeating itself. So this one time he finished a 4-month stretch in county jail, a probation violation, and there he is sitting in front of my desk. And he says what gang members often always say, "This time it'll be different." I said, well, all right. So with him sitting there, I call a friend of mine named Gary, who runs a vending machine company in Alhambra, California, and he had hired homies in the past. I'm hoping against hope, maybe he'll do it again. And sure enough, he says, yeah, you tell that guy he can start tomorrow. That's a holy man right there. So Dreamer went to work at the vending machine company. Well, 2 weeks later, there he is again in front of my desk. I couldn't even believe my eyeballs. I said, Híjole Madre Santa, here we go all over again. But this time he reaches into his pocket and he pulls out his very first paycheck and he waves it proudly and he says, damn, G, this paycheck makes me feel proper. I mean, my mom, she's proud of me, and my kids, they're not ashamed of me. And you know who I have to thank for this job. And I said, well, gosh, who? And he looked at me strangely and he said, well, God, of course. And I said, oh, sure, no, that's right. That would be God. You thought I was going to say you. I said, no, gosh, God's number one. You are so lucky we're not living in them Genesis days. I'm sorry, them Genesis days. He goes, yeah, because God would have had struck down your ass already by now. Well, the thing I remember most is we just fell out of our chairs, howling with laughter. And I defy you to identify exactly who's the service provider, who's the service recipient. It's mutual. So Homeboy was born a long time ago, 30 years, as was mentioned when I was pastor of a poor parish, housing projects, 8 gangs, highest concentration of gang activity in the world, my parish. I buried my first young person killed because of this sadness in 1988. I buried my 222nd 2 months ago. Not all from that community, but I know a lot of gang members. I get asked. So the first thing we did was we started a school because there were so many middle school, junior high age gang members who had been given the boot from their home school. Nobody wanted them. So they were wreaking havoc in the projects, violent, selling drugs. So I walked out to them and I said, hey, you know, if I found a school that would take you, would you go? Each one said, yeah, I would. And then I couldn't find a school that would take them, you know, so that kind of forced my hand. So right across the street from the church is our parochial school, grades K to 8, first 2 floors. But the entire 3rd floor was the convent where the ninjas lived. And so I gathered all the nuns together in the living room. I sat them down and I said, hey, you know, would you guys mind, you know, moving out? And we could turn the convent into a school for gang members. And they looked at each other and they went, sure. And that was the extent of their discernment process. And so then they all came to this school, members from 8 different gangs. It was a tough place. I had a principal last exactly 1 day. And then they all started saying, if only we had jobs. And myself and the women, we marched around the factories that surrounded the projects trying to find felony-friendly employers. And that wasn't so forthcoming. So we started things, a maintenance crew, a landscaping crew, a graffiti removal crew, a crew to build our child care center, all made up of rival enemy gang members from the 8 gangs. And then in 1992, after the Rodney King verdict, the whole city of LA exploded, ignited, except for the poorest pocket in the city, my parish. So then the LA Times wanted to know why that was, and I said, I think it's because we had 60 strategically hired rival enemy gang members working side by side. So they had a reason to get up in the morning and a reason not to ignite their own community. The next day, a movie producer named Ray Stark, who happened to have $500 million, read this article, and he summoned me, and he said, what should I do with my money? I see now that I woefully undershot my request there. But I said, why don't you buy this bakery across the street from the school? It's got ovens. We could put hairnets on rival enemy gang members. They could bake bread. We could call the place Homeboy Bakery. And he said, sure. So then we were off and running. A month later, we started Homeboy Tortillas in the Grand Central Market. Once we had plural, we changed our name from Jobs for a Future to Homeboy Industries, as if there was any industry involved here. Not everything worked, I'll be the first to admit it. Homeboy Plumbing really was not hugely successful. Who knew? People didn't want gang members in their homes. I did not see that coming. And now nobody intends to do such a thing, but we evolved, we've backed our way into becoming now the largest gang intervention, rehab, reentry program on the planet. So 15,000 folks a year walk through our doors trying to catch the crumb of hope that falls from the table. They all want part of the 18-month training program. Therapy, case management classes, free tattoo removal. No place on the planet Earth removes more tattoos than we do. A designated clinic, 3 laser machines, a paid physician assistant, and 47 volunteer doctors, 30,000 treatments a year. If anybody's starting to regret their panther tattoo, see me afterwards. No questions asked. And you know, if you go to the margins and you listen to people, they'll tell you what to do. It never occurred to me to do this, but a homie came in named Frank, who I'd never met before, and he was 2 days out of Corcoran State Prison, and he's sitting in front of my desk, and tattooed on his forehead, filling the whole space like a damn billboard, and pardon my French, it said, "Fuck the world," filling the whole space. And he looked at me and he said, you know, I am having a hard time finding a job. And I said, well, Frank, maybe we could put our heads together on this one, you know? So I went, I hired him naturally, and he bagged bread, and then I went looking for a doctor, and I found one at White Memorial Hospital who donated 1 hour a month to chip away at Frank's forehead because he had a laser machine, and about 5 other guys. And pretty soon I had a waiting list of 3,000 gang members who wanted the same service, so we couldn't really stay with that arrangement. And parentheses, Frank is now a security guard at a movie studio, and there is no trace left of the angriest, dumbest thing he had ever done, proving once and for all that every one of us is a whole lot more than the dumbest, angriest things we've ever done. Then we have all our businesses: Homeboy Bakery, Homeboy Silkscreen, Homeboy Homegirl Merchandise, Homeboy Grocery, where we sell chips, salsas, and guacamole in all the Ralph's stores, which is a Kroger's thing, I guess. Homeboy Diner, the only place you can get food at City Hall. We have a restaurant at LAX at Terminal 4, American Airlines. Homeboy Recycling, where we do e-waste. And Homegirl Cafe, where women with records, young ladies from rival gangs, waitresses with attitude will gladly take your order. and they cater. It's kind of a who's who. If you ever go there, you'll run into a movie star probably, or a elected Jim Carrey and Jack Black and Forrest Whitaker. And once, even with 2 hours notice, Vice President Joe Biden, when he was vice president, came. He wanted to eat at the famous Homegirl Cafe, so motorcade and entourage and Secret Service. Selfies with Uncle Joe. I wasn't there. I was making my annual 8-day retreat, but when I got back, I ran into a homie who did kind of a debrief, Louis Mora, and he said, while you were gone, we were visited by an MVP. Do you mean a VIP? That one, a VIP, yeah. Damn, gee. Imagine here at Homeboy Industries, we were visited by the Vice President of the United States, Mick Romney. I think you can file that one under all white guys look alike. But I believe we did add a current affairs class shortly thereafter. But most famously of all, Diane Keaton showed up for lunch, Oscar winner, Godfather movies. Her waitress is Glenda, and Glenda's a big girl, been there, done that, tattooed. She does not know who Diane Keaton is, and so she's taking her order, and Diane Keaton says, what do you recommend? And Glenda rattles off the 3 dishes she likes, and Diane Keaton says, I'll have that second one. That one sounds really good. And it's at that moment, for some reason, this big girl, tattooed, felon, parolee gang member looks at Diane Keaton. She goes, wait a minute. I feel like I know you from somewhere. You know, like maybe we've met. And Diane Keaton decides to deflect it humbly. Oh, gosh, I don't know. I suppose I have one of those faces that people think they've seen before. And then Glenda goes, no, now I know. We were locked up together. Yeah, that took my breath away. And I don't believe we've had any further Diane Keaton sightings now that I think of it. But suddenly, kinship so quickly, Oscar-winning actress, attitudinal waitress, exactly what God had in mind, and we need go no further than hearing Jesus say to the gathered, that you may be one. The last thing in the world Jesus wants it to be about is Him. I don't know, is something happening? Thank you very much. I have no idea where I was, but anyway, this is probably too hot, would be the other thing. Otherwise, I have to hold it out here. All of us are called to be enlightened witnesses, people who through our kindness and tenderness and focused, attentive love return people to themselves. At Homeboy, we're kind of allergic to the notion of holding the bar up and asking gang members to measure up. Our exhausted God doesn't do that. Why would we do that with each other? Instead, we hold the mirror up and we tell people the truth, knowing that my truth is your truth and your truth is a gang member's truth. And it's all the same truth, and here's the truth. You are exactly what God had in mind when God made you. And then you watch folks on the margins as they become that truth, as they inhabit that truth, and no bullet can pierce it, no 4 prison walls can keep it out, and death can't touch it because it's huge. But everybody at Homeboy knows that you have to reach in and dismantle messages of shame and disgrace that get in the way, that keep people from seeing their truth. For the principal suffering of the poor throughout history and throughout Scripture is shame and disgrace. In the Acts of the Apostles, they say this very odd thing, and they say simply, "And awe came upon everyone." It would seem that the measure of our health in this community or any community may well reside in our ability to stand in awe at what the poor have to carry, rather than stand in judgment at how they carry it. So I get invited to give talks, and I was invited to speak to 600 social workers in Richmond, Virginia. And it was an all-day gang-in service from 9 to 5, and so I figured, well, maybe I'll give the keynote at the beginning or speak at lunch, or maybe I'll close the day. It was in a hotel ballroom. I said yes, and I bought my ticket. But a week before I was to fly, I pulled the letter out, and to my horror, I discovered that I was to be the only speaker all damn day. And I said to myself, oh, hell no. And so I called in two homies, Andre and Jose, and I sat them down, trainees, gang members. And I said, look, you're flying with me at the end of the week to Richmond, Virginia. I'd like you to get up in front of 600 social workers and tell your stories. Take your time. Because we got a long-ass day to fill. So Jose gets up first in front of 600 social workers, and can you just turn that down just a little bit, just because it's feeding back and it sounds like aliens are landing. And so he gets up in front of 600 social workers, and he's a 25-year-old guy, gang member, out of prison, tattooed. He was in like his 15th month of our 18 months. And he had found himself as a very valued member of our substance abuse team, a man solid in his own recovery. Now he was helping younger homies with their addiction issues. And so, he was in prison for quite a stretch, but he also was a homeless man for a long stretch, and a heroin addict for an even longer stretch. So he gets up in front of 600 social workers and he says, I guess you could say my mom and me, we didn't get along so good. I think I was 6 when my mom looked at me and said, why don't you just kill yourself? You're such a burden to me. Well, 600 social workers audibly gasp. And then he says, it sounds way worser in Spanish. And we got whiplash going from gasp to laugh. I think I was 9, he continued, when my mom drove me down to the deepest part of Baja California, and she walked me up to an orphanage, and she knocked on the door, and the man came to the door, and she said, I found this kid, and she left me there for 90 days. Until my grandmother could get out of her where she had dumped me, and my grandmother rescued me. My mom beat me every single day of my elementary school years with things you could imagine and a lot of things you couldn't. Every day my back was bloodied and scarred. In fact, I had to wear 3 t-shirts to school each day. First t-shirt because the blood would seep through. And second t-shirt, you could still see it. Finally, the third t-shirt, you couldn't see any blood. Kids at school, they'd make fun of me. Hey, fool, it's 100 degrees. Why are you wearing 3 t-shirts? Then he stopped speaking, so overwhelmed with emotion, and he seemed to be staring at a piece of his story that only he could see. And when he could regain his speech, he said through his tears, I wore 3 t-shirts well into my adult years. because I was ashamed of my wounds. I didn't want anybody to see them. But now I welcome my wounds. I run my fingers over my scars. My wounds are my friends. After all, how can I help heal the wounded if I don't welcome my own wounds? And awe came upon everyone. The measure of your compassion lies not in your service of those on the margins, but only in your willingness to see yourselves in kinship with them. For the truth of the matter is, if you don't welcome your own wounds, you may well be tempted to despise the wounded. I was interviewed once by a woman on the Christian Broadcasting Network, and she asked me what we did at Homeboy, and I told her everything I just told you. I don't think I said the thing about what was tattooed on the forehead. It was the Christian Broadcasting Network, after all. After I finished like 20 minutes of going on and on about tattoo removal and therapy and a community of tenderness and a place where gang members feel cherished, and job training, etc. She looked at me when I was done and she said, yeah, but how much time do you spend each day at Homeboy Industries, praising God? And I didn't know what to say, so I said, all damn day. And I don't think she liked that answer very much. But it begs this question: what kind of praise does our exhausted God have any interest in? So let me end with this. It does occur to universities sometimes to force their students to read my book against their will. I'm not complaining. But my alma mater, Gonzaga University in Spokane, forced the incoming freshmen to read it, and so they said, could you come and speak? And we want you to speak at this big venue with 1,000 people, and oh, can you bring 2 homies with you? And I do if the trips aren't too multiple, and if people are going to pay for it. And I always pick homies in the same way. I pick enemies, rivals, trainees at our place who are from rival gangs, just to force them to share a hotel room, just to mess with them. And I always pick homies who had never flown before, just for the thrill to see gang members panicked in the sky. Not long ago, I was flying to DC. We were at LAX, 2 older vatos, and one guy says, hey, are we flying Virgin Airlines because it's our first time? I said, why, yes, it's a requirement. We'll be coming home on American. So I invited these 2 guys, Bobby, an African-American gang member who worked in the bakery at the time, and Mario, who worked in the merchandise store. And I've done this hundreds of times, maybe nearing 1,000 men and women. I've never taken anybody more terrified of flying than this guy, Mario. I mean, unbelievable. He was petrified. He was hyperventilating. And we hadn't even boarded the plane. So we're at Burbank Airport, which is kind of a small airport, big bay windows, Southwest Airlines mainly, big planes, but they don't have that hermetically sealed chute that you get on to board the plane. You have to walk out onto the tarmac like you're the president, and you climb up the steps to board the front of the plane, and the big feature at Burbank are the steps to board the back of the plane. And so I'm sitting there with Mario. Bobby's off walking somewhere. It's early morning. Our plane arrives, and I said, that's our plane. And I think, wow, he may die before we actually climb those stairs. So then I see our flight crew arrives, and it's again early morning, and there are 2 flight attendants, females, with very large cups of Starbucks coffee, and they're schlepping up the front steps to get on the plane. And Mario says, when are we going to board the plane? I said, as soon as they sober up the pilots, there they go now. Well, perhaps I shouldn't have said that. So I should tell you that in my 30-year history with Homeboy, Mario is the most tattooed individual who's ever worked there, which is really saying something. He's all sleeved out. His neck is blackened with the name of his gang. Head shaved, covered in tattoos, forehead, cheeks, chin, eyelids that say "the end," so that when the time comes to lie in a coffin, it'll say "the end." And I'd never been in public with him, and he and I are walking through the airport, and people are like this, and mothers are clutching their kids more closely, and I'm thinking, wow, that's interesting, because if you were to go tomorrow to Homeboy and ask anybody there who's the kindest, most gentle soul who works here, they won't say me. They'll say Mario. Yeah, Mario. He sells baked goods now over our counter bakery. He's proof that only the soul that ventilates the world with tenderness has any chance of changing the world. So we get to Gonzaga, and as often happens, they have the big talk at night. What they don't tell you is they've planned 94 other talks all day long. This class, this meeting, this class, this lunch, this class. So I tell Mario and Bobby, look, I'm going to sit in the back of the classroom. I want you to get up and tell your stories. And they do, and though they're quite nervous, especially Mario, stories of torture and terror and abuse of every imaginable kind. Honest to God, if their stories had been flames, you'd have to keep your distance, otherwise you'd get scorched. I would not have survived a single day of their childhoods. So the nighttime talk comes, and they weren't really planning on doing this, but I said, hey, I want you guys to get up before me and speak for like 7 minutes each. Give a snapshot of your life, and so that I can include you after my talk in the Q&A period. And they were nervous, but they got through it. And then I have them stand on either side of me. Okay, yes, ma'am. And a woman stands and she goes, yeah, I got a question. It's for Mario. First question out the gate. And Mario's a tall, skinny drink of water, and he comes up and he clutches the microphone. Yes? And he's just terrified. And she says, well, you say you're a father and you have a son and a daughter. They're about to enter their teenage years. What wisdom do you impart to them? What advice do you give them? And Mario clutches the microphone and closes his eyes, and he's trembling, and he's getting a friggin' hernia trying to come up with whatever the hell he's going to say. When suddenly he blurts out, as soon as he says those two words, he retreats back to his closed-eyed microphone clutching retreat. And now he's really trembling, and now I know he's losing this battle with his tears. But he wants to get this sentence out. I just don't want my kids to turn out to be like me. And there's silence until the woman who asked the question stands, and now it's her turn to cry. Why wouldn't you want your kids to turn out to be like you? You are loving, you are kind, you are gentle, you are wise. I hope your kids turn out to be like you. And 1,000 total perfect strangers stand, and they will not stop clapping. And all Mario can do is hold his face in his hands, so overwhelmed that this room full of strangers had decided to return him to himself. But they, in turn, were also returned, which shouldn't surprise us, because it's mutual. And I think that's the only praise our exhausted God has any interest in. Ohio Dominican University is not the place you've come to. It's always going to be the place you go from. And you go from here to create a community of kinship such that God might recognize it, knowing that only the soul that ventilates the world with tenderness has any shot at this. And pretty soon you cease to care whether anyone accuses you of wasting your time. For in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing. We don't go to the margins to make a difference. We go to the margins so that the folks at the margins make us different. Thank you very much.